A word of caution. This episode contains descriptions of child sexual abuse that may be difficult for some listeners. In 1980, a memoir titled Michelle Remembers chronicled a woman's experience of childhood torture inflicted by a satanic cult. Canadian resident Michelle Smith recovered these memories, which allegedly occurred over a 14-month period when she was 5 years old, while working with her psychiatrist, Larry Pazder. Michelle and Larry did an extensive media and book tour where they talked about the memories Michelle had uncovered after hours of hypnosis with Pazder, and in most of the interviews, the psychiatrist answered questions for Michelle. No one ever asked her family if these claims of abuse at the hands of a satanic cult were true, or divulged what happened after the book was published, which was that Larry Pazder left his family and married Michelle Smith. A 2023 documentary titled Satan Wants You explores the ramifications of the book Michelle Remembers and how it sparked over a decade of fears about child abuse and satanic cults. Today we're talking about 7 people working and residing in a small town in eastern North Carolina who were caught up in what some now consider a modern-day witch hunt. Their lives, and I'm sure the lives of the children involved in the accusations, haven't been the same since. There is much to love about North and South Carolina, but the two states have also had their fair share of violent and senseless crimes over the years. From murders on the Blue Ridge Parkway, in the heart of big cities or sleepy college towns, and along the coastal waters, some of these stories may be new to you. Some may have happened in your town. Some may involve people that are still missing to this day. But all will leave you remembering to always be vigilant about the people you meet and the places you go. I'm Renee Robertson. Please join me for Missing in the Carolinas. Episode 106, The Little Rascals Daycare Case. Not long after Michelle Remembers was published, 2 couples in Bakersfield, California, became embroiled in satanic cult child abuse allegations. The accuser was a woman named Mary Ann Barber, who became concerned when she learned one of her step-granddaughters said she was inappropriately touched by a grandfather. This abuse was confirmed by a medical doctor, but no charges were ever filed in the case. Barber became convinced that the girls' parents, Alvin and Debbie McQuan, were unfit and wanted the license of the in-home daycare Debbie ran revoked. She requested that the Social Services Department perform a surprise inspection on the daycare, where the social worker found nothing of concern. But Barber would not back down. She became enraged when Alvin and Debbie took the girls to see the grandfather who had allegedly abused one of them, and she worked to gain custody of her step-grandchildren. After that, she began telling people a large sex ring existed in Kern County, and with her coaching, the girls began talking about a satanic cult that physically abused them, forced them to act in pornographic films, hung them from ceiling hooks, and so forth. People involved in this sex ring included Alvin and Debbie McQuan, their friends Scott and Brenda Niffen, the social worker who had failed to find fault with Debbie's daycare, and 2 other social workers. Police took the word of the girls and their step-grandmother, Barber, although they had no physical evidence to corroborate any of the abuse allegations. The Niffen children were questioned and told they could be reunited with their parents if they cooperated with police. This included asking leading questions about child sexual abuse. They told the police what they wanted to hear. A local doctor performed a controversial test on the children that he said could prove sodomy had occurred, and this test has since been discredited. Both the McQuans and the Niffens were put on trial, convicted on multiple charges, and given a combined sentence of more than 1,000 years in prison in 1984. Other Kern County residents were eventually accused of similar charges, despite no proof of physical evidence or exact dates abuse was said to have happened. The McQuans and Niffens had their convictions overturned in 1994. In 2004, the television show Dateline ran an episode covering the Bakersfield, California child abuse sex rings. The show shared that of the 39 people who were convicted, 10 were given probation and 29 went to prison. Of those 29, 23 had their convictions overturned. 3 were released after serving their sentences, 1 woman died of cancer while in prison, and 1 man remains in prison. A small preschool in California also became embroiled in a child sexual abuse scandal that resulted in the longest and most expensive trial in American history. In 1983, investigation into the McMartin preschool began when a woman named Judy Johnson, whose 2.5-year-old son had attended the McMartin preschool on about 10 different occasions, placed a call into the local police department. She alleged that Ray Buckey, the 25-year-old son of preschool owner Peggy McMartin Buckey, had molested her son. Ray worked as a school aide at McMartin preschool. When police asked Johnson's son if he could identify Ray in a photo lineup, he couldn't. The police still searched Ray Buckey's house and confiscated items they felt were significant to the child molestation case: a rubber duck, a teddy bear, and some Playboy magazines. He was arrested on September 7, 1983. The next day, the police chief of the Manhattan Beach Police Department sent a letter to 200 parents who were clients of the preschool letting them know Ray Buckey was suspected of child abuse. The letter specifically asked parents to question their children to see if they had been a witness to any crime or been victimized. The letter also listed the following criminal acts they were investigating Ray for, including oral sex, fondling of genitals, buttock or chest area, and sodomy, possibly committed under the pretense of taking the child's temperature. Also, photos may have been taken of children without their clothing. Any information from your child regarding having ever observed Ray Buckey to leave a classroom alone with a child during any nap period, or if they have ever observed Ray Buckey tie up a child, is important. The police chief ended the letter by asking parents to keep the investigation strictly confidential and to not discuss it outside of their families. Well, you can imagine how that went. Discussions about the charges against Ray Buckey quickly ran rampant in the community. Emboldened, Judy Johnson began telling people that Peggy Buckey, Ray's mother, was involved in satanic practices and had taken Judy's son to a church to watch a baby being beheaded, along with several other bizarre claims. The district attorney's office decided to bring in a consultant for the Children's Institute International, or CII, an agency that had the mission of identifying and treating abused children. Parents were asked to send their children into CII for interviews with a woman named Kee McFarland that lasted up to 2 hours at a time. She led the children through a series of very leading questions and offered them rewards if they answered correctly. This is evident in the interview transcripts that you can find publicly online. I'll put links to all my sources over at missinginthecarolinas.com. By March of 1984, 384 McMartin preschool students were identified as having been sexually abused. 150 of those children also received medical examinations. The doctor, who also worked with the Children's Institute International, claimed that 80% of the children she examined had been molested. These findings were mostly based on medical histories and the philosophy that all children should be believed when they say they are abused. She used a magnifying device called a colposcope and detected scarrings in the genital and rectal areas of the children that she claimed pointed to sexual abuse. Later, other researchers would dispute her findings and say that those scarring patterns were common even in children who have not been abused. All in all, 7 different people involved with the McMartin preschool were indicted on criminal charges. Those included Ray Buckey and his mother Peggy Buckey, Peggy Ann Buckey, a high school education teacher and sister of Ray who sometimes helped out at the school, Virginia McMartin, the original founder of the preschool, and 3 other preschool teachers. Together, they were indicted on almost 400 charges of sexual crimes, even though the school had been operating for 20 years without any previous complaints. Searches of the defendants' homes never turned up any signs of incriminating evidence or nude photographs of the children. There was no evidence of secret rooms or underground tunnels where the abuse was to have taken place. The preliminary hearings in the case started in early 1984 and was filled with twists and turns, including more and more evidence that the questioning techniques of Kee McFarland, with her puppets and dolls called Mr. Alligator, Mr. Snake, Detective Dog, and Mr. Sparky, were controversial at best. In a strange twist, before the trial began, Judy Johnson, who was the first to come forward with the claims of abuse, was found dead at her home at Manhattan Beach. An autopsy later showed she had died of a fatty metamorphosis of the liver, a condition related to alcoholism. In 1986, a new district attorney took over and called the case incredibly weak, dropping all charges against Virginia McMartin and the 3 teachers that had been charged, Marianne Jackson, Betty Rader, and Babette Spittler. Peggy and Ray Buckey remained in custody with no bail for Ray and a $1 million bail set for Peggy. This case would last 7 years in total, cost $15 million, and in the end resulted in no convictions and all charges being dropped by 1990. However, by that point, Ray Buckey had been in jail for 5 years without ever having been convicted of the crimes he was accused of. According to media sources, he eventually moved out of the area, changed his name, and went to law school. I wanted to discuss the McMartin case because North Carolina had a similar occurrence with a series of accusations that occurred at a preschool in Edenton, North Carolina. It was also a costly case that relied mostly on the testimony of young children and seemed to start, again, with one disgruntled mother. Lou Powell, a retired journalist from Charlotte, was so frustrated by this case that he created a blog called LittleRascalsDaycareCase.org, where he has an extensive archive of news articles, academic and professional articles, videos, transcripts, and court documents. Special thanks to his diligence and attention to detail in gathering all of this information in one place. It was extremely helpful in putting together this episode. Edenton native Betsy Kelly opened up the Little Rascals Daycare Center at a home on Court Street in July 1986 alongside her husband, Bob. Bob also worked as a golf pro and ran a local plumbing business. Business was doing well, and eventually they outgrew their space. Betsy's father, Warren Twitty, helped them buy an old bottling plant in downtown Edenton so they could better care for the children at the preschool, along with their growing staff. The business opened up in the new location in late September of 1988. Just a few days after that, a woman named Jane Mabry, who had been a longtime friend and acquaintance of Betsy Kelly, said her son told her Bob Kelly had slapped him at the center. She confronted Betsy and expected an apology for the slap, which Bob said was an accident. She grew angry when she did not get the response she desired. As Mabry later explained in the PBS Frontline documentary Innocence Lost, she later spoke to another acquaintance with a child at Little Rascals and learned that the child was saying Mr. Bob had molested him. They began talking with other parents about these allegations against 41-year-old Bob Kelly, and soon involved the Edenton Police Department, which happened to have a staffer, Brenda Toppin, who had just attended a seminar on recognizing signs of satanic ritual abuse. A few months after the disagreement between Jane Mabry and the Kellys, someone filed a complaint alleging child abuse at Little Rascals with the Department of Social Services in January 1989. In April, Bob Kelly was arrested and charged with 12 counts of multiple sex offenses. His bail was set at a little over $1 million. The center closed at the end of that month. Edenton is a small community, and at first some parents had serious doubts about the sexual abuse claims, and they had never seen it in any signs of their children. One mother later told PBS the daycare had a very open-door policy, and she'd never seen anything suspicious when she would drop in to pick up her son at different hours of the day. But as the rumor mill continued on, a sense of panic grew, and more parents took their children in for interviews with law enforcement and therapists. In September 1989, Bob's wife, 34-year-old Betsy, was arrested on sexual abuse charges, along with a man named Scott Privet, who was a friend of Bob's and who owned a local video rental store. He had never set foot inside Little Rascals. Not long after, Shelley Stone, Catherine Dawn Wilson, Robin Byram, and Darlene Bunch were also arrested on similar charges. They were caregivers at Little Rascals, except for Wilson, who cooked meals for the children. The defendants were all charged on the basis of forensic interviews 4 therapists conducted with the children in the community. Of course, everyone wanted to believe the children when they said they had been abused, but where was the physical evidence? According to an article that ran in the News and Observer, children told the therapist they had been sodomized, beaten, and forced to participate in orgies while at Little Rascals. Some also said they had flown on spaceships and swam with sharks alongside Mr. Bob and other adults. Prosecutors never presented any physical evidence that children had been sexually abused. Some of their parents pointed to incidents of bedwetting, nightmares, and fears of going to the bathroom alone as evidence backing up the children's claims. Before we continue, let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsors.
They are the families of the missing in America, and they're desperately searching for answers.
Somebody knows something.
I'm Josh Mankiewicz. Join me for Season 3 of Missing in America. Listen carefully, because just one small detail might allow you to solve a mystery.
We have seen miracles happen.
Dateline, Missing in America. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you looking to level up your writing or learn a new skill? Whether you focus on nonfiction or are more inclined to creative writing, or want to learn how to put together a digital portfolio of your work, Wow Women on Writing can help. Interested in podcasting? Check out a digital course I created called You Can Start a Podcast. During this pre-recorded webinar, you will learn the benefits of creating your own podcast, materials you need to get started, how to develop content that will keep listeners coming back for more, and ways your podcast can create supplemental income. I'll share examples of different types of podcasts, how to decide on a format, ways to handle the technology necessary for creating a podcast, how to develop your first few episodes, promotion and monetization ideas, and ways you can repurpose your podcast content. All written materials and resources are provided by me. I'll also give you a handout with information discussed in the webinar, along with suggestions for a few different types of podcasts to explore. Best of all, this webinar only costs $30. You can find it by going to wow-womenonwriting.com and clicking on the Classroom tab. I'll also post a link in the show notes. Here's your friendly PSA that if you haven't been using the skincare products from SkinxErin, you might be doing it wrong. But it's never too late to do the right thing. Here are a few ways you can make the most out of the skincare products from SkinxErin. In addition to cleansing your face, the pre-cleanse oil also makes an excellent shaving balm, reducing irritation and protecting your skin. It moisturizes your face too. The Hydrating Beauty Oil is a savior for scorched summertime hair. Just massage a few drops onto your fingertips and work into those dry ends to quickly replenish your locks. And if you happen to linger too long in the sun without reapplying sunscreen, hey, it happens, use the Perfecting Night Oil, which will dramatically increase healing from a burn with its high levels of antioxidants. Go ahead and treat yourself with 10% off your order by using my code MissingCarolinas10. I'll include a link in the show notes for you. And now, let's get back to the show. Bob Kelly eventually went on trial in July of 1991 in Farmville, North Carolina, about 90 miles away from Edenton. Originally charged with more than 248 accounts of abuse involving 29 children, the number was reduced to 100 charges of abuse involving 12 children. The trial lasted 8 months, with a dozen children testifying. The court transcript shows some very interesting statements by the children, including going on boat rides where babies were tossed into shark-infested waters and hot air balloon rides into outer space. These children who testified had never claimed to have experienced sexual abuse before being interviewed by the therapist brought in to assist the police. A jury found Bob Kelly guilty on 99 accounts of the child sexual abuse, and he was sentenced to 12 consecutive life in prison terms. Bob's wife, Betsy, finally had her bond reduced to $400,000 in October of 1991, and she was able to leave jail. Catherine Wilson, the cook at Little Rascals, struggled with whether or not to take a plea deal in the case or go to trial. She had a young daughter and feared if she took a plea deal, the state could still take her daughter away from her. She took the risk and was found guilty of sexually abusing 4 different children in January 1993. She was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. She gave birth to a son while behind bars. Her case went under appeal in September of that year, and she was able to go and live with her mother in Statesville after being released on $250,000 bond. Fearful that she would also be convicted on the child sexual abuse charges, Betsy Kelly made the difficult decision to plead no contest to 30 counts of child abuse in January of 1994. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison, with credit for 2 years and 2 weeks already served. Scott Privet, the video store owner, also pleaded no contest to 37 counts of felony child abuse as part of a plea agreement after serving 3 years and 8 months in jail. The charges against Shelley Stone, Robin Byram, and Darlene Bunch were all eventually dropped in 1996. In May of 1995, the North Carolina Court of Appeals ordered new trials for both Bob Kelly and Catherine Wilson. Defense attorneys argued that the judge in Bob Kelly's trial should have inspected the transcripts of the interviews with the children prior to the trial beginning, and he didn't. Parents of those children were allowed to testify as expert witnesses. A juror had failed to disclose that he had been sexually abused as a child, and another juror brought in an article that ran in Redbook magazine describing traits of pedophiles and shared it with the jury. Another juror drove to Edenton against the judge's orders to view the Little Rascals daycare building in person. 3 of the jurors later told the media that they didn't want to vote for a guilty verdict, but they were intimidated and criticized by the other members of the jury until they did so. In May of 1997, prosecutors in the Little Rascals Daycare Center case announced they were dropping all the charges against Bob Kelly and Catherine Wilson. Assistant District Attorney Amanda Lamb said the following: "The paramount thing is not having to drag these children through this again. The charges are being dropped so that wounds can be healed." However, Lamb did say they would retry Bob Kelly on 8 new sexual abuse charges that were unrelated to the Little Rascals case. They said they had discovered Bob had raped and molested a 9-year-old girl in Edenton in the summer of 1987. Bob Kelly said he had known the family, but never met the victim. Betsy Kelly's father, Warren Twitty, told the News and Observer he believed the remaining charges in the Little Rascals case were dropped because PBS was about to release an update to their Innocence Lost series about the case. Ofra Bickel had produced 3 episodes in the series. In 2007, she received the John Chancellor Award for her reporting for PBS Frontline and the series, which began to bring some of the many holes in the prosecution's case to light. The parents, police, interviewers, and prosecutors involved have never publicly admitted any error in their behavior in the Little Rascals case. In 1999, those remaining charges in the separate sexual abuse case involving Bob Kelly were finally dropped. It was too late for the Kellys' marriage by then. Though they tried to move forward, irreparable damage had been done to their relationship after having weathered so many accusations and both having served time in prison. They divorced not long after Bob was released. Scott Privet had a similar experience. He was married when he was first accused in the case and divorced while in prison. He later remarried when he was released. This past spring, Robin Kudo, who was arrested in the case when she was 18-year-old Robin Byram, co-authored a book with Betsy Hester titled 21 Boxes, Robin's Story and the Tragedy of the Edenton 7. I haven't read the book, but it is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other area bookstores. You can learn more at the website betsyhester.com. One of these documents that stood out to me from Lou Powell's archives as a thoughtful reflection of what actually happened in the town of Edenton. The letter writer, Anthony Obershaw, a sociologist at the University of North Carolina, was writing in response to a 1993 column Dennis Rogers wrote for the News and Observer titled, "What Happened in Edenton?" I'd like to read that letter now. February 3rd, 1993. Dear Dennis, as a faithful reader of your News and Observer column, I would like to comment on your January 28th musings about what happened in Edenton. I believe we are sending innocent people to prison, but I don't believe it is because of mass hysteria. All the actors in this tragedy, the children, the parents, the jurors, the therapist, firmly believe they are doing right. In the absence of physical evidence of sexual abuse and of an adult eyewitness, the case rests on the testimony of the children. Why would they testify to abuse if it didn't happen? The children first denied that they had been abused. It took many therapy sessions over many weeks before they agreed with their parents and the therapist on the abuse. As long as the child denied it, the parents and therapists interpreted the denial as proof of the abuse. The child was so traumatized, she couldn't even talk about it. The more therapy was administered, there was no way the child could ever convince the parents and therapists that it hadn't happened. In this drawn-out and emotionally charged process, the children learned that by admitting to sexual abuse, they would please their parents and the therapists. And they did, and became convinced that they were telling the truth. In the therapy sessions with the sexually explicit dolls, the children also learned the vocabulary and knowledge of sexual acts that they used in court. Children who turned out not to be impressionable in the therapy did not testify. Why did parents suspect sexual abuse at Little Rascals, and why do jurors believe the children's testimony, though the same children have testified to fantastic events that no one believes? For the past 2 decades, the public has been exposed to news reports on sexual abuse of children. Parents and jurors in East Carolina are no exception. What these parents and jurors perhaps don't know is that child abuse studies show that the offenders are most likely to be family and other kin, not strangers and daycare staff. Sexual child abuse is believable because it does happen. Once rumors about it circulated in Edenton, apprehensive parents looked for behavioral symptoms in their children. They might not know, or perhaps ignored, that touching genitals, masturbation, and the like are part of normal child development in the preschool years. A child who manifested these behaviors, and some others like bedwetting, was assumed to act in this particular manner because of the sexual molestation at Little Rascals. These children were then taken to therapy, with results that we all now know. The jurors come from the same communities as the parents. They believe the children because they know there is child abuse about and because they do not have a clear understanding of the therapy process, although some jurors from the first trial have since expressed doubts about their verdict. But there are no monsters and there is no mass hysteria. If there is a dark side, it is the state prosecuting on such evidence. What would make me change my mind? Some evidence, any evidence, that does not result from children who have been in therapy and counseling. It is conceivable that one staffer at Little Rascals sexually molested children, but that 7 engaged in some perverse compact, for there would have to be collusion between them for it to be covered up, in a building wide open to the public, is beyond the bounds of credulity. For the sake of justice and the 7 wrongly accused whose lives have been irreparably damaged, one hopes that the Little Rascals case will unravel, as similar cases did in California a few years ago, when the next accused are put on trial. As ever, Anthony Obershaw. This brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Missing in the Carolinas. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and give it a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, so please like our pages and get started on a discussion of the missing people profiled on the show. Like what you hear? You can buy me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com, Renee Robertson. Do you know of a missing persons case in North or South Carolina that you think should be covered? Email me at missinginthecarolinas@gmail.com with any details you can share. And don't forget to check out our sponsor, Wow Women on Writing, and the great programs and writing contests they have to support writers at wow-womenonwriting.com. Treat yourself to a skincare kit from SkinxErin with my code MissingCarolinas10. Cover art for this podcast was designed by Macintosh Multimedia. Sound editing is provided by Daniel Robertson. Thanks so much for listening.